The key stopped halfway in the lock. Not slipped. Not jammed. Stopped like the door had decided mid-breath that it no longer recognized my hand. For a second I blamed myself. My fingers were stiff that afternoon, swollen from the heat and age and a lifetime of doing more than they should have. I pulled the key out, wiped it against my sleeve and tried again, slower this time. Careful like you are when you don't want to admit you're afraid of the answer. Nothing. The metal resisted me, firm and unmoving. I stepped back from the door, heart thudding so loudly it felt rude against the quiet street. The house stood exactly as it always had. Pale brick glowing under the late sun. Flower pots I'd helped pick out flanking the steps. The porch light I'd replaced myself when it flickered last winter. The same house I'd unlocked countless times with this very key. The same door I'd painted with my own hands, laughing as green dripped onto the concrete because we couldn't stop talking long enough to be careful. I rang the bell. Once. Twice. Nothing. I waited, telling myself not to jump to conclusions. People miss doorbells. Babies cry. Phones buzz. Life gets loud inside houses like this. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Soft. Rushed. A whisper hushed, urgent. The faint scrape of movement upstairs. A curtain shifted just barely and snapped back into place. Someone was home. They just weren't opening the door. My throat tightened. I rang the bell again, this time slower, firmer, as if pressing harder might remind the house who I was. On the porch, a folded stroller rested neatly against the wall. One tiny sneaker lay abandoned beneath the swing. Pink and impossibly small. Proof that this place still held pieces of my life. Proof that I hadn't imagined my place in it. Or maybe proof that my place had already been packed away. I laughed then, quiet, breathless, wrong. The kind of laugh that slips out when your mind is scrambling for footing and can't find it. I pressed my lips together to stop it, but it came anyway, cracking through me like glass. Okay. I whispered, though I didn't know who I was talking to. Okay. I walked back to my car slowly, each step deliberate, like I was carrying something fragile that might shatter if I rushed. My hand shook as I opened the door and sat behind the wheel. I didn't cry. Not yet. I just stared straight ahead, watching the house in the mirror until it blurred. At home I made tea and forgot to drink it. The house felt too large, too hollow, like the sound had been turned down on my life. I drifted from room to room, touching familiar things. The edge of the table, the back of a chair. Grounding myself in objects that hadn't changed even if everything else had. On the refrigerator door hung crayon drawings. Uneven hearts. Shaky letters. Best grandma ever. I pressed my fingers to the paper and felt something inside my chest fold in on itself. Had I imagined that too? My phone buzzed once. Hope flared before I could stop it. It wasn't them. Just a message trying to sell me insurance. I sat at the kitchen table as the daylight drained from the windows, replaying the moment at the door over and over. The lock, the silence, the way the house seemed to hold its breath around me. I didn't yet understand what had been taken from me. But I knew this much with chilling clarity. That door hadn't stayed closed by accident. And whatever it meant, it was only the beginning. If the lock wasn't a mistake, then what had I done that made me a stranger at my own door? The answer didn't come that night. Came the next morning, quietly, like most things that change your life do. I woke before the alarm, my body stiff, my mind already racing as if it had been awake for hours without me. The house was still, wrapped in that early morning hush where even the walls seemed to listen. I lay there staring at the ceiling, replaying the sound of the lock refusing me. The whisper inside the house, the curtain snapping shut. I told myself there had to be a reasonable explanation. Maybe they were busy. Maybe the message hadn't been meant the way it sounded. Maybe this was the one I clung to hardest. Maybe love couldn't disappear that quickly. I made coffee I didn't want and toast I couldn't finish. The chair across from me stayed empty, but my eyes kept drifting to it anyway, as if someone might suddenly sit down and explain everything. I checked my phone again. Still nothing. By mid-morning, the silence started to feel deliberate. That's when the memory surfaced. Not the lock, not the door, but the phone call from the day before. The one I'd brushed aside at the time because it seemed so ordinary. Can you watch the baby this weekend? I'd been sitting on the edge of my bed when she asked. Laundry folded neatly beside me, my knee aching in that dull, familiar way it always did when I'd overdone it the day before. I remember hesitating just for a second, because something in her tone felt sharp around the edges. "I can't this weekend," I'd said carefully. "I have a doctor's appointment Saturday morning." The silence that followed hadn't been empty. It had been loaded. "So you're just not being very supportive of our family," she said. Supportive. The word echoed now louder than it had then. I carried it with me as I moved through the house that morning, replaying it over and over, turning it in my mind like a bruise you keep pressing to see if it still hurts. Supportive of our family. As if my entire existence could be summed up by whether I was available on demand. I hadn't raised my voice. I hadn't refused out of spite. I'd simply said no, one small, ordinary no, and somehow that had rewritten everything. Around noon my phone buzzed. My breath caught before I even looked. It wasn't a call. It was a message. "Please don't come by the house anymore. We need boundaries. We've changed the locks." I read it once. Then again. Then a third time, slower, as if the words might rearrange themselves into something kinder. Boundaries. That word landed differently than supportive. Colder. Cleaner. Like a door being shut with intent. I sat down hard in the nearest chair, my legs suddenly weak. There was no greeting. No explanation. No acknowledgement of how final it sounded. Just a line of text, efficient and absolute, turning me from mother to liability in under 20 words. I didn't reply. I couldn't trust myself to type anything that wouldn't beg, or bleed, or betray how small I suddenly felt. Instead, I stared at the screen until it went dark, leaving my reflection behind. Older than I remembered, eyes wide with something that looked a lot like disbelief. That was when it began to dawn on me. The lock hadn't been the first boundary. It had just been the loudest. If one quiet no could cost me access to their lives, how much had my yes really been worth all these years? I spent the rest of that day moving through my house like I didn't quite belong to it. I kept expecting the phone to ring. Not with an apology, not even with kindness, just something that would soften the edges of that message. A follow-up, a clarification, anything that suggested I hadn't just been erased with a few taps of a thumb. Nothing came. By evening, the quiet stopped feeling accidental. It settled in deliberately, pressing against my ears, my chest, my thoughts. I turned the radio on and off 3 times before finally leaving it silent. I didn't want noise. I wanted answers. And since none were coming from outside, my mind went digging inward. I started remembering all the times I'd said yes without being asked properly. "Yes, I'll come over after work." "Yes, I can keep her overnight." "Yes, don't worry about paying me back." "Yes, I'll cancel my appointment." "Yes, I'll figure something out." The memories came uninvited, lining up one after another like receipts I'd never meant to keep. Late nights rocking a crying baby while my daughter slept upstairs. Emergency grocery runs. Birthday cakes baked after long days when my joints screamed and my hands shook, but I smiled anyway because that's what mothers do. I told myself it was love. And maybe it was. But maybe it was also fear. Fear that if I stopped being useful, I'd stop being wanted. That thought sat heavy in my chest as I wandered into the hallway closet, the one I hadn't cleaned out in years. I wasn't looking for anything specific. I just needed to move. To do something with my hands before my heart swallowed me whole. That's when I found the folder. Thick. Yellowed. Labeled in my own careful handwriting from years ago. Family expenses. I stood there holding it, surprised by its weight. Not physically, it wasn't heavy like that, but emotionally like it contained a version of myself I hadn't dared to look at. I carried it to the kitchen table and opened it slowly. Inside were records. Not notes of affection or memories or moments, but numbers. Dates. Transfers. Agreements. Big things I'd handled quietly so they wouldn't have to worry. Things I'd never mentioned again once the crisis passed. I hadn't kept them to throw in anyone's face. I'd kept them because that's who I was. Organized, responsible, the one who remembered details so others didn't have to. But sitting there, flipping through page after page, I felt something shift. I wasn't looking at generosity anymore. I was looking at evidence. Evidence of how deeply woven I'd been into their survival, and how easily I'd been cut out the moment I stopped functioning on command. I closed the folder and leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling as the realization settled in slow and heavy. They didn't lock me out because I was cruel. They locked me out because I said no. And for the first time in my life, I asked myself a question that felt dangerous in its honesty. If my worth disappears the moment I set a limit, what exactly have they been loving all this time? If saying no made me expendable, what would happen if I stopped giving altogether? I didn't sleep that night, but it wasn't the frantic kind of sleeplessness where thoughts spiral until morning. It was quieter than that. Sharper. Like something inside me had finally sat up and said, "Enough watching. It's time to understand." By dawn, I was already at the kitchen table, the yellow folder open in front of me again. Morning light spilled across the pages, softening the harshness of the numbers but not their meaning. Each line told the same story in a different way. I was here when you needed me. I showed up. I paid. I waited. I traced one entry with my finger, then another. It wasn't anger I felt. It was clarity, a cold, steady awareness that settled into my bones and refused to move. This wasn't about money. It never had been. It was about access, control, the quiet understanding that my place in their lives was conditional. My phone buzzed mid-morning, making my heart jump before I could stop it. I stared at the screen for a long moment before picking it up. The name made my stomach tighten. Not an apology. A question. "Hey," the message read. "Did something happen with the bank? A couple payments didn't go through." I laughed out loud then. Not because it was funny, but because the timing was too perfect to ignore. The locks could change. The silence could stretch for days. But the moment the money stopped moving, suddenly there was concern. I set the phone face down on the table and didn't answer. That was new for me. Normally, I would have rushed to explain. I would have softened the moment, reassured everyone that I hadn't meant to cause trouble. I would have apologized for existing inconveniently. Instead, I made another cup of tea and let it cool untouched, watching steam rise and disappear like something finally being released. Late that afternoon, I found myself standing in front of the mirror. I didn't recognize the woman looking back at me, not because she'd changed overnight, but because I was seeing her without the filter of obligation for the first time. Her shoulders were straighter, her eyes steadier. Tired, yes, but awake. I reached for my old address book, the one with the cracked spine and pages softened by years of use. My finger hovered for a moment before stopping on a name I hadn't called in a long time. The lawyer. The call was brief, polite, professional. "I'd like to make an appointment," I said. "As soon as possible." When I hung up, something unexpected happened. I didn't feel guilty. I didn't feel cruel or dramatic or afraid of what they'd think. I felt solid, like I had finally stopped shrinking myself to fit into a space that no longer wanted me anyway. And as evening settled over the house, a single thought echoed louder than the silence had the night before. If setting a boundary made me the villain, then maybe I'd been the victim for much longer than I'd ever admitted. If one appointment could change the balance of power this much, what would happen when I reclaimed it all? The first call came the next morning. I recognized the number immediately, even though it had never called me before, not directly. Usually, messages came filtered through my daughter, softened or sharpened depending on the need. This one rang straight through, loud and insistent, like it expected obedience. I let it ring. That alone felt like rebellion. When it stopped, a message followed, carefully worded, polite in the way people get when they're trying not to sound worried. "Hi, just checking in. We noticed a few things didn't go through. Probably a mistake. Can you call when you get a chance?" Mistake. The word sat there, neat and harmless, pretending nothing had shifted. I didn't respond. Instead, I went about my morning slowly, deliberately. I watered the plants. I wiped down the counter. I folded a blanket that didn't need folding. Each small task felt like a way of telling myself, I am allowed to exist without reacting. By noon, the second call came. This one shorter, tighter. By evening, the tone changed. Now there was frustration behind the politeness, impatience wrapped in concern. I could hear it even through text, the subtle shift from "Are you okay?" to "Why aren't you fixing this?" And still, no one mentioned the lock. No one acknowledged the message that told me not to come by. No one asked how I'd felt standing on that porch, key useless in my hand. It was as if that moment didn't count, because it hadn't cost them anything. That night, I sat at the kitchen table with the lights off, phone face down beside me. I realized something then that made my chest ache in a way grief never had. They weren't worried about losing me. They were worried about losing what I provided. The difference mattered. The next morning, I drove to the lawyer's office. The building was quiet, neutral, designed to make everything feel manageable. When I sat down across from him, I didn't launch into explanations. I didn't justify myself. I need to revoke the power of attorney, I said, and I want to make changes to my will. He didn't look surprised. As we went through the paperwork, page by page, something unexpected happened. The weight I'd been carrying for years didn't fall off all at once, but it loosened. Each signature felt like a boundary made permanent. Each initial a quiet declaration. I am not invisible. When I left the office, the sky was overcast, but the air felt lighter. I sat in my car for a moment before starting the engine, hands resting calmly in my lap. For the first time since the door hadn't opened, I wasn't replaying the moment anymore. I was moving past it. And somewhere in the back of my mind, a new question surfaced, one I couldn't ignore. What would happen when they realized this wasn't a phase, but a decision? When the money stopped and the silence held, would they finally ask why? Or would they only demand I undo it? They didn't ask why. Not really. They asked when. When can we talk? When will you fix this? When are things going back to normal? Normal. That word followed me through the next few days like a shadow. It showed up in messages, in carefully measured phone calls, in the tight pauses where empathy should have lived. Normal was what they wanted restored. As if normal hadn't required me to bend until I barely recognized my own shape. I listened. More than I spoke. I noticed how every sentence curved back to inconvenience, stress, schedules, bills. How no one asked if I was okay. How no one mentioned the door, the lock, the text that had cut me out of their lives in under a minute. It was like watching a house burn while everyone argued about the cost of water. One evening, after the third call I didn't answer, I sat on the edge of my bed and finally let myself feel it. Not the anger, not the betrayal, but the grief beneath it all. The quiet kind. The kind that doesn't scream. It just sits beside you, heavy and patient. I grieved the daughter I thought I had. I grieved the version of myself who believed love meant endurance. And I grieved the years I spent filling spaces that were never meant to be mine to hold alone. The next morning, I did something small that felt enormous. I packed a bag. Not everything. Just enough. Clothes I liked. Books I'd been meaning to read. The blue sweater that made me feel like myself instead of someone's backup plan. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. I didn't know explanations anymore. When I locked my own door behind me, the sound was different. Not sharp. Not final. Just certain. The place I went wasn't far, but it felt like another life. Quieter. Slower. No expectations humming in the air. For the first time in years, I woke up without an agenda shaped by someone else's needs. Days passed. Then a message came, not from my daughter but from a smaller name on the screen. My granddaughter. It was short. Misspelled. Honest in the way only children are. Grandma, I miss you. Are you mad at me? The words knocked the breath out of me. I stared at the screen for a long time, torn between instinct and wisdom. Every part of me wanted to rush back, to smooth things over, to sacrifice again just to stop that ache. But another part of me, the one I'd finally started listening to, knew something just as true. If I returned without being whole, I'd teach her that love means disappearing. I typed a reply slowly. I'm not mad. I love you. Always. I didn't explain more than that. That night, lying in an unfamiliar bed, I understood something with a clarity that hurt and healed at the same time. I hadn't left them. I had finally stopped leaving myself. If loving her meant staying strong instead of staying silent, could I hold that line when the past came knocking again? I went back to the house on a quiet afternoon, the kind where the air feels paused and the sky hangs low like it's listening. Not their house. Mine. The one I'd lived in long before I learned how easily love could be confused with usefulness. I unlocked the door and stepped inside, and for a moment I just stood there, letting the familiar weight of the place settle around me. The creak of the floorboard near the hallway, the soft tick of the clock I'd never replaced, the faint smell of old books and lemon cleaner. Nothing here demanded anything from me. That was when it finally made sense. The door that hadn't opened, the lock that refused me, was never about punishment. It wasn't even really about rejection. It was the moment the truth broke through the habits I'd built my life around. That door closed because I had already been closed out long before the lock was changed. I just hadn't seen it yet. I sat down at the kitchen table, the The same place I'd stared at my phone waiting for answers that never came. Only now I wasn't waiting. I was remembering. Every time I swallowed hurt to keep the peace. Every time I apologized for needing rest. Every time I paid, drove, watched, fixed, hoping it would secure my place. I had taught them a lesson without realizing it. That I would always unlock myself for them. And the moment I didn't, when I said no, when I chose my own body, my own health, my own dignity, the system broke. The relationship didn't bend. Snapped. That wasn't my failure. That was the truth finally standing up. The knock came 3 days later. Not loud. Hesitant. When I opened the door this time, there was no key between us. Just a small girl with her backpack slipping off one shoulder. Eyes searching my face like she was afraid I might disappear if she blinked. "Mommy said I could stay for the weekend," she said softly. "If you're not busy." Busy. The word almost made me smile. I stepped aside and let her in. We didn't talk about the lock. Or the messages. Or the silence that followed. We baked cookies and read stories and sat on the couch with a blanket we both pretended wasn't too small. She fell asleep with her head on my arm, breathing slow and steady, trusting without question. Later that night I stood by the door, the same door I'd once been shut out of, and rested my hand against it. I understood now. That door didn't close to teach them a lesson. Closed so I would finally learn mine. That love doesn't require access to your pain. That boundaries are not betrayals. That being a mother doesn't mean being consumed. And that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is let a door stay closed, so another one can finally open inside you. If this story felt familiar, ask yourself this. Which door in your life keeps closing? Because it's waiting for you to choose yourself.